Well, good afternoon. It is afternoon now, and we will move forward with services a little bit late, but getting things done nonetheless. So I want to start with the sermon first to make sure that we're able to go through the webcast okay with the timing that we have, and then I'll cover the announcements after the sermon. Then we'll have our final hymn and closing prayer. But I want to go ahead and start where we left off and pick back up on a message about tithing. In that first sermon, we established some of the following. Tithing was a law. It is a command. Some question that, well, it's not a command. It's not one of the 10 commandments, but it is a law, and it is a command from God. All things belong to God, and he says, all things are mine, and he only requires 10% back. We proved that it wasn't just for agriculture, as some people claim. And to not tithe is a sin, because it is a command of God, it is a law, and God says, if you don't tithe, you are stealing from me. That is sin. The tithe command that God gives us is about our relationship with him, and that was one of the main points I wanted to emphasize on the first sermon on the first tithe, is that the tithing system, God doesn't need the money. It all belongs to him anyway, and it all goes back to him. But it is about our relationship with him and developing a relationship and developing a trust with him. I'll start off by asking a few questions. Do we have trouble tithing because we don't think we're going to have enough? I mentioned that in the first message because sometimes people say, well, if I tithe, I won't have enough to live on. Are you going to trust God and have faith that he is going to take care of you? Because tithing is a test of faith. There's a lot of test of faith, even like incidents like today where the traffic is bad. It's getting easier and easier as I get older to accept, okay, traffic's bad, but maybe it's to prevent me from being in an accident, or it may have prevented me from being in the accident to begin with. You just kind of roll with things, but you learn to trust God and have faith. And that's part of this relationship that he's expecting from us in tithing. So tithing is a test of faith. And he says, if you're faithful in the little things, you'll be faithful in much. Now, we can't have the attitude, as I mentioned, that, well, there's not going to be enough if I pay God, if I pay my tithes. I want to start off today with a quote from John D. Rockefeller. Now, that's not a name we hear very often now. When I was growing up, that name was very prominent and still well known. J.D. Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller lived from 1839 to 1937. He was the world's first billionaire. So, talk about a billionaire in 1937. It says he apparently controlled 1/60th of the entire U.S. economy. 1/60th of the economy was his. He owned that much and was worth that much. But I want to read a quote from J.D. Rockefeller. He said, I would have never been able to tithe the first $1 million I ever made if I have not tithed my first salary, which was $1.50 per week. Now you think, well, $1.50 a week, that's not much. Even then, compared to today, if he were 20 years old when he started working, which he probably started before that, many people in that era started about 12, doing manual labor and hard work. But let's say he was 20 years old when he started. Compared to today, that $1.50 is worth about $60 US or 44 pounds per week. Not a lot of money. But yet he said, if I wouldn't have tithed on that small amount, I couldn't have tithed on that first million. Other famous men who tithed historically, and you might be surprised at some of the names that you hear of men who tithed. Henry John Heinz, Heinz 57, Heinz ketchup, Henry John Heinz. Sir William Colgate, who invented Colgate and Palmolive. James L. Kraft, Kraft Foods. Henry Parsons Crowell, founder of Quaker Oats, and J. Willard Marriott. Now, you're probably familiar with the Marriott chain. These are individuals that tithed. And although they're not a part of the church and weren't a part of the church, they believed in the tithing system. And they looked at the scriptures and said, I need to tithe. I need to pay God 10%. And it's interesting to see they were tremendously blessed. Now, in the tithing system, many of them, I've read about those individuals and read some of the history on them. Some of them, including J.D. Rockefeller, tithe, but they didn't know where to send the tithe. So they gave it to charities, they gave it to organizations that did good, but they gave their money in a tithe as they were commanded to do. I want to pick back up today with a second tithe. We covered first tithe. Now, it doesn't say they had second tithe and went and kept the feast. They understood tithe, and many people think that there's one tithe, even those who believe in tithing. But I want to start with the second tithe today. And years ago, when people came into the church, they usually learned about the Sabbath or the holy days or the tribulation, and I don't want to be in the tribulation. And they start attending church, and they're like, wait a minute, what is tithe? They keep hearing tithe. Oh, you give 10% to God. And they're like, whoa, that's a lot of money. Then they hear about second tithe, and they're like, there's a second tithe? And then it's interesting, I've heard people say, oh yeah, and there's a third. And then they begin to question, what did I just get into? Do we look at the second tithe as important as the first? And do we look at it as something that is commanded? Or do we think, well, since it's used for me, I can use it for whatever I want. I don't need to look at it as strictly as I do the first tithe. If it's used on me, why can't I dip into it? Why can't I borrow from it? Or I'll borrow from it and then I'll pay it back. Some would never dream of taking anything from their first tithe. Sometimes people set aside the tithe and they keep it into place until they have a certain amount, and then they mail it off. But many would never think, well, I'm going to go borrow from that, because they look, well, that's God's money. So is second tithe. It's God's money, but he says, here's what I want you to use it for. But some don't view it as important. But I want you to remember the purpose. What is the purpose of tithing? It's not that God needs your money. He is developing a relationship with you. And the second tithe goes right along with that there is a purpose of developing this relationship with him through the holy days, through the opportunity to understand his plan as he's revealing it. He wants a relationship with you, and he's asking you to be involved. And in fact, he invites you to the feast. When he talks about the Feast of Tabernacles and the spring holy days, he said, you are to come up, you're called to these festivals. They are a holy gathering of my people. He is inviting you to be a part of it. And there are certain words that are used about the holy days that talk about that invitation. There have been some over the years who have missed the Feast of Tabernacles because they spent their second tithe. They say, I don't have the money to go. They missed being able to go to the place where God has chosen to place his name. And in doing so may have not only stolen from God, because second tithe is God's, but weren't able to follow his command to be at the feast, which is a command. There are others who really don't believe in a second tithe at all. They say there's only one tithe, it's the first tithe. And they even combine the information of the second and the third, and they say, well, yeah, but there's only one. It's talking about the same tithe. But remember, the first tithe was to go to the Levites. It says it's to go to the Levites, today used for that spiritual temple, the church. And we saw that as proven through Scripture, that's where the tithe went, to the Levitical priesthood. Of the second tithe, let's go back. On the first tithe, he says none of it was to be used by the consumer. Now, the second tithe was different, and it's spelled out very clearly. If the first tithe, you don't consume any of it, it's not the same as the second, which he says you're to consume it. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 23. Deuteronomy 14 and verse 23. Let's start in verse 22. He says, "You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year." And this is the scripture some will latch onto and they say, oh, see, it's agricultural. I don't have to tithe. Because it says all the increase of your grain. One commentary states, this was only a vegetable tithe. Oh, good, I'll just tithe on my vegetables. And I don't grow vegetables, so I don't have a tithe. Another one says, it is a second tithe or a festival tithe. So it's okay, this one is on track. But it is only used the first and second years, and the third year, you give that second tithe to the poor. Well, okay, now they're off, because now if you give up that tithe in the third year and you give it to the poor, what's going to happen? What is that particular festival tithe used for? Well, if individuals who say, well, it's only a vegetable tithe, read further. He says, verse 23, "You shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to place his name to abide, the tithe." Now notice he says, "of your grain, of your new wine, your oil, firstborn of your herds and of your flocks." Not just a vegetable tithe. So he says you're to take it and eat it in the place that he chooses. It wasn't given to the Levites. It was to be eaten by you. So what is the purpose of the second tithe? That you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. It's relationship with him. He said, I want you to learn to have a respect for me, and I want a relationship with you, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So it is another test, and it determines, are you going to follow God? Are we going to save the second tithe as God commanded so that you can then keep his feast? Because he says, I want you to keep the feast, but he says, and I've laid out a way that you can keep the feast, and not just that you can make it there, but that you can know and understand by what I'm having you do, that you're to eat it, consume it, and enjoy that feast because it pictures something as a time of prosperity. So he wants to know, are we going to save that tithe so we can keep the feast? And are we going to go to the feast and keep it? But it shows God whether you're willing to follow him. God wants to know, are you going to follow me? Just as with Abraham, he said, now I know that you will serve me and only me. He wants to know, are we going to follow him? Are we going to follow that command and keep it? And can God say of you, now I know that they are going to tithe, and to be willing to forsake everything to follow after him. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 24. So he says, if the journey is too long for you that you're not able to carry the tithe. Now, if you just sold your herds and you sold your vegetables and you've got a tenth of it set aside, for many, a tenth of their flock or a tenth of their herd and a tenth of their vegetables would probably be a row of animals and a cart full of vegetables. So he said, if it is too far or too long for you that you're not able to carry it, or the place where the Lord God chooses to place his name is too far from you when the Lord God has blessed you. There are so many descriptions of the tithe where God says, if you tithe, I will bless you more. Or if you tithe, you're going to be blessed. So he said, once you exchange that money, if it's too far, once God has blessed you, you exchange it for money, take the money in your hand, go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. Now, if you don't save second tithe, if you say, well, that's an optional tithe, or I don't believe in the second tithe, how are you going to go to his feast? He's invited you, and he said, I'm providing a way for you to be there. Verse 26. You shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires. Many find it difficult to do that. Many look at the second tithe and they say, well, I'm here at the feast and I'd really like this, but I feel guilty spending it because it costs so much. Or I feel guilty eating a nice dinner because it just costs so much money. Or we can't get dessert, or we can't get wine with dinner because it's just, it's 7 pounds a glass for a glass of wine. That would be here. If you go to Italy, it's far less in euros. But people feel guilty purchasing something or buying something that they want because they think, well, it's above my means. And normally it would be, but God says this is a time you buy and spend that money for whatever your heart desires. He says for oxen or sheep. So you go to the feast and you buy an oxen. You've got 8 days, and probably in 8 days you're not going to eat an entire oxen. But if you go in with other families, you say, if we buy this, can we let's split this lamb, or let's split this ox. And he says for wine or for similar drink or whatever your heart desires, and you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. Now, we looked at this word in the first sermon about tithing, the word before. He says, you shall eat there in the place that he's chosen before the Lord your God. The word before, according to Brown Driver Briggs' definition, is in front of or face to face. So he says, I want you to consume these things that your heart desires, and I want you to eat it there face to face with me, in front of me. I want to watch you consume this because I want to watch you enjoy what I've given you. It's like when we give our kids allowance. Not anymore because they're grown. But when we used to give our kids allowance, we used to give them money from time to time, or you give them money for something that they achieved, and you give them something to spend, and it's fun to watch them spend it. Can you take me to the store? And they go through thinking, what can I buy it on? Now, they do some of the same things as we do as adults. They go to the store and they go, if I buy that, it takes up all of my money. I don't want to buy just that because I want my money to go further. But it's fun to watch them spend it in front of us, face to face with us. So God says, I'm inviting you to keep this feast, and I want you to keep it in front of me, before me, face to face with me. Once again, it's about relationships. But the tithe is to be spent on keeping and enjoying the feast. The first one, he says, you send it to the Levites, you do not consume any of it. Second one, he says, you enjoy it, you buy things with it, and you consume it in front of me. Because it pictures a time of plenty. When we save 10% of our income and we spend it in 8 days, that's a lot of income compared to the rest of the year. And you can have a different week at the Feast of Tabernacles than you've had any other time of the year. It's a time of giving and sharing and providing others who are in need. And it's a time of eating and drinking what we normally can't afford to have. So there are privileges that the second tithe provides. It allows us to be at the festival that God says, I command you to be at, but it also provides us the opportunity to enjoy some finer things. It also provides travel. He said, if the place be too far, well, because you can't make one place that is easily accessible to everyone, especially in the world today. Because of the Feast of Tabernacles, we've been able to travel many times with our kids. Australia, Mexico, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Italy, Africa now for the Feast of Tabernacles. And these kind of trips would not have been possible, especially with a family, if it wasn't for second tithe. And when God tells us that if you save this, I will bless you, one particular year, we took our kids to Australia. We went to Australia, New Zealand, and we had planned on going to the Caribbean. We were living in the States and planned to go to the Caribbean, but flights had gone up and up and up, and they were quite expensive, almost anywhere in the Caribbean. And it was less expensive for us to go to Australia and enjoy the feast than it was to go to the Caribbean, which is usually the first place outside the U.S. that you can go and be able to afford. But we were able, for $600 round trip, to fly to Australia and including New Zealand. In a time, my wife and I went the first year we were married, and I bought my ticket. We got engaged, we got married, but in the engagement period, I bought her ticket, $1,300, about 10 years prior. So here we get ready to go to the feast with the kids, and it's $600 round trip. We were able to take our kids to Australia. So we asked the kids, I know you wanted to go to Jamaica. They're telling us that they need us to go somewhere else. We looked and we can go to Australia. Is that okay? And they're like, Australia? Now, I will share with you, they acted surprised. They said, but we won't know anybody in Australia. And I said, you'll be surprised. There'll be people that you know. And there were, because people traveled from the U.S. and they were able to enjoy meeting new young people and individuals that they knew already. But that's what this is designed for. God says it is for you to be able to travel. You turn that tithe into money, if it's not already, and you travel. Some will ask, well, what about saving some of that money for another year? Because I never earn enough that I could go somewhere and travel internationally. Some years people have excess and they help others. Some go through and purchase whatever their heart desires and yet still may have extra. The question has come up to headquarters multiple times in the past. Can I save some of my second tithe from one year to be able to go somewhere more exotic or different another year? And the answer is yes. You think about how they paid their tithe in the Old Testament. If they had herds and flocks and they had a spring harvest, but then the fall harvest was their major income, they had one major time that they sold all their vegetables and sold their produce and sold their animals and oil or wine, whatever they produced, and then that's when they had their tithe. And it was a lot easier at that time to say, okay, here's how much I have now in tithe, and it's right here in my hands. But it was once a year. They didn't tithe most likely monthly because they don't know yet what their increase or their income is going to be. So for us, we tithe in a different way. For us, it's quite often weekly, sometimes bi-weekly. That's a U.S. term. Every fortnight. And I finally I'm like, okay, I got to look this up. And you probably already know. Fortnight comes from an English word meaning every 14 nights. Fortnight, 14 nights. So some people get paid every fortnight, every 2 weeks. Some people get paid monthly, some quarterly. I mentioned when I owned my own business, I had a quarterly tax report from my accountant, and so I paid my tithes quarterly because I didn't know what my income was until that time. So I paid my tithes quarterly, and sometimes you have to adjust, I paid my tithes, but then there was a huge loss right after I paid my tithes, and now second quarter I'm under, and you balance out that tithe that is paid. But yet, since we get paid differently, whether it's once a year or whether it is once a week, to set aside a little bit and to save some of that tithe for the next year, as long as we still consider it holy, that's God's tithe. It's not, I'm going to take a little portion of it and, it's not sitting there with my second tithe, so maybe I can touch into that. We still have to consider it holy, and it has to be used for that intended purpose. One can sometimes set back an amount, and it may take a second year before you're able to go internationally. It's like a little stash fund of second tithe to be able to do something internationally. Now, what we don't want to do is, I want to go somewhere internationally next year, so I'm going to set aside some tithe, and we're going to be eating ramen noodles this year, kids, and we're going to sit in a tent because we're saving up to go somewhere different. You have to keep the feast as God intended. He said, you buy whatever your heart desires, and I don't think it's sleeping in a tent with ramen noodles. You need to save and be able to provide those things. But if you do have enough in that year, it's not wrong to set it aside and use it for the purpose of attending wherever God has chosen to place His name in the future. But there's a purpose behind the second tithe, just as there's a purpose in the first tithe. it allows us to picture something. And we see by the way we're supposed to keep it and the way we're supposed to spend that money at the feast, that it pictures something different. Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 13. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 13. He said, "You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days." Now, I've dealt with this in the ministry in 20 years, and I've heard this back in worldwide. Well, you're only commanded to be there the first and last holy days. No, he commands us to be there 7 days. He said, we are to observe that feast 7 days when you've gathered in the threshing floor and your wine presses, not just vegetables, a threshing floor and your winepress. He says, "And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son, your daughter, male servant, female servant, Levite, stranger, fatherless, and widow who are within your gates." He said, whoever is within your realm or your control of who you have to take care of, who you're working with, if you have servants and they're living and they're working for you and under you, he said, these are the things that you are to rejoice in, but not just you, your entire family. Everyone within your gates. So he's talking about relationships with other people. So he says, you have a relationship with me. I want you to consume it before me, but I also want you to enjoy it with those within your gates. He says, 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to the Lord in the place which your Lord your God shall choose, because the Lord will bless you in all your increase and in the works of your hands, so that you shall surely rejoice. He said, if you tithe and you set this aside, I want to bless you in your work and produce so that there's even more, so that you can surely rejoice, that you can come and say, I know why I have this. God blessed me with it. So here's a command to tithe and to keep the feast. But it comes with a promise that God says, if you do this, I want to bless you. I want to deepen that relationship with you. So the second tithe is clearly to be used for the keeping of God's festivals. It helps guarantee that we will be there. Because if you save 10% of your income, we have festival locations that are close enough for those who, if it's their assigned site, 10% of your income will get you to the feast. Now, it can be used for spring holy days. Individuals have asked about that. Well, for the spring holy days, if it's used to keep the feast, is it only the Feast of Tabernacles? Well, if you're going to eat out on a holy day or for the night to be much observed, to use your second tithe to be able to go enjoy the night to be much observed, the church recognizes that is going to the place that God's chosen. It is keeping his festival. And you don't want to use, well, okay, then if that's okay, I'm going to spend half my tithe in the spring and half in the fall. Well, then you're missing 8 days of being able to pay for hotel food and all the things that you need to keep those 8 days. It is mainly used for the fall festivals and for travel to be in the place which he has chosen so that you can stay there for that full period of time. So the tithe makes it possible for us to be able to rejoice. If we don't tithe, it's very difficult to rejoice if you go to the feast. Because most people that don't tithe and they just go to the feast, they're like, my credit card is racking up. It's hard to rejoice when you're going, now for everything I purchase, I have to pay for. Where if you keep the feast the way God intended, everything you purchase is already paid for. God says, you've set the tithe aside. That's mine, and I want you to spend it for whatever you want. Now, to eat what we normally aren't able to eat the rest of the year comes from that tithe. To go to places we're not normally able to go to, because he said, I want you to understand you're having a foretaste of a time of plenty. Now, it doesn't matter whether you have a very low income, which I think now 20 or 30% of the citizens of the United States are in poverty level, what they call poverty level. If you're living even below poverty level, if you save 10% of your income, you'll be able to keep the feast, and it's going to be a time of plenty far more than any other time of the year based on your income. That you will have a huge amount of that tithe set aside to enjoy a time of plenty. because it pictures that millennium when there will be a time of plenty. I'm very much looking forward to the feast in Bournemouth, and we sent out the information this week on housing, and now I'm getting email after email. We're so excited about coming to the UK for the feast, which makes me excited to receive them and enjoy their visiting here. But it is a time to enjoy that plenty or enjoy it with other people. Now I want to look at third tithe. And if you hadn't heard of third tithe, you can have that shock. A third tithe. First, again, I want to go back over there's key points to remember from Scripture. He says the first tithe was given to the Levites, which is the house of God. And we looked at that. It's the house of God as the church of the living God. It is for the church and the work. The second tithe, he said, the first one you don't consume. The second one, you are to consume it. It is to be used by the tithe giver. And you use it to keep the feast on whatever your heart desires. And it says in Deuteronomy 14 that the second tithe is year by year. It doesn't say keep it 2 years and the third give it away. He says you do it year by year. So it says year by year, just as we do the annual festivals, happen year by year, and they are connected. Now we come to a third tithe. We know the third tithe is different and it's separate from the first tithe and second tithe because of the way it is explained and how it's to be used. So what is the third tithe for, and how is the third tithe to be paid? Who is it paid to, and who is it consumed by? We get the question, does the church believe in the third tithe? And I always turn that question around, do you believe in the third tithe? And they're like, well, I think I do, but I just don't understand. Does the church believe in the third tithe? I want to read from a member letter. This was June of 2018. We handle third tithe differently today than we did 30 years ago, but we still believe in the third tithe. So does the church believe in the third tithe? Yes. We teach a third tithe. Some think, well, it's been done away with, or the church has watered things down because now we don't do a third tithe. It has not. And we fully believe in a third tithe. Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 28. Deuteronomy 14, verse 28. If the second tithe is year by year, we see the description of the third. It says, at the end of every third year, you shall bring the tithe of your produce that year and store it up within your gates. And some will say, well, yeah, you bring the tithe that you saved, not the one you sent to the Levites, but the one you saved and you just give it away. First tithe was used by the Levites. Second tithe was for the festivals. It says every year or year by year. Now the third tithe. Verse 29, it says, you store it up within your gates, and the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow who are within your gates, may come and eat and be satisfied. And that the Lord God will bless you in all your work and all in what you put your hands to do. Again, he says, this tithe, if you tithe it, I will bless you. But notice it says it's to be used for the fatherless, the widow, those who are within our stranger, within our gates, and that they may come and eat and be satisfied. It doesn't say that they can follow you to the feast and use your second tithe. It says that they can come. Did the purpose of third tithe change? We think of third tithe and we think, well, that's for those who are needy, those who are poor, those who are financially having a difficult time, or those who are going through trials or struggles. But is the purpose of tithing the same? God says, I want to bless you in all your work, and I want you to love your neighbor as yourself, basically is what he's saying. He says it's about that relationship, and it's about keeping my law to the fullest. So we see a third tithe is not necessarily associated with the festivals. That's why we have festival assistance and we have third tithe assistance. And they're different. We see when God says to tithe, first, second, and third, he says, I am going to bless you for it. That's another part of the test. Trusting God that if I do this, God is going to bless me. And he wants to bless us for giving to him or in giving to others as he's commanded what is already his. I remember one of my third tithe years when I was a young adult. Sometimes I would picture in my mind or plan out and think, well, how am I going to make ends meet? This is my third tithe year. And paying the third tithe every 3 years, I knew when that was coming up. Most people do. So you have 30%, first, second, and third tithe, and then taxes. At that time, when I was a young adult, that was 50% of my income. Now it's higher. Sometimes taxes are 50% alone, but before tithes. But I want to share with you this particular third tithe year. I'd gotten a job shortly after Ambassador College. When I graduated college, I was going to come back and start my own construction company. I love carpentry and building, and I was in construction from the time I was 14. So I had developed a love of building and construction and carpentry. I was going to open my own construction business, and of course, young adult, you can do anything, and I come back and, oh, life's hard. It's going to take some time to get a business going. So I got a job after college and in sales, and I didn't hesitate paying my third tithe. The job wasn't paying a whole lot, but at least I had a job. And I can't say, well, I wasn't worried about it, because when you take those off first and then say, okay, what do I have left? It makes you think about things. But during that third tithe year, I did that. I paid it anyway. During the third tithe year, I was paid with a higher paying job. And when I say higher paying job, it was twice the amount that I was earning. So I paid tithe, and God says, okay, I'm going to bless you. He blessed me with twice the income. I was able to buy my first brand new vehicle, the first new one I ever bought. Now I don't buy new vehicles, I buy older ones because I've learned the value of them drops very quickly as a new vehicle. But I then, and for the job I was doing, I needed a good vehicle. So I bought my first new vehicle. The physical and spiritual blessings continued to pour in that year. I was able to, because it was third tithe, help and assist others. But as God said, the windows of heaven would be open. He had opened them and poured out a blessing on me, and I knew where it came from. I knew, and because of that relationship that was being developed, where that blessing was coming from. Now, we also need to remember, blessings aren't always financial. Because people will say, well, God says he'll open up the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing, and I haven't had any financial blessings yet this year. It's like, where does it say he's going to pour out financial blessings? Sometimes we don't consider the blessings that God gives to us. Health is huge. Not having health problems. And sometimes I ask people, did you have to go to the hospital this year? No, my health is great. I haven't had any health problems. It's like, is that a blessing? That's a huge blessing, because in a world we live in, there are multiple health issues. Sometimes it's wisdom, growing in knowledge, growing in spiritual development, growing in conversion or character. Sometimes it is the people that you get introduced to that you develop some very strong friendships and relationships with, and you go, that is a huge blessing. God says, I will open up the window of heaven and pour out a blessing on you. Now, he does tell us that all of your needs will be taken care of, but he doesn't say, I'm going to double your income. That was a huge blessing for me, and I understood that. I didn't expect it, and I didn't expect, well, if I tithe the next time, he's going to double my income again. It doesn't happen that way. But we have to understand where those blessings come from. And whether it's first, second, or third tithe, God says, I will bless you for it. Whether that blessing is financial, whether it is to prevent you from having to spend money. Sometimes people, especially if you own a house, you realize I own a house and so I pay into that house and I fix the house and I do all these things that you have to upkeep a house with. Sometimes you don't have those expenses. So we see third tithe, as it was commanded, is not saved every year. So he says every third year. And it's used in multiple ways for those who are within our gates. Within our gates means those who are within our realm of being able to help, or those who we are responsible for. So what do we do with our third tithe? Well, it can be sent in the church. Some people say, well, it has to be sent to the church. No, it can be. It can be given directly to help someone in one of those categories that are mentioned. I had people tell me back in Worldwide Church of God, it has to be sent to headquarters. Fortunately, my pastor also understood the scriptures, and he said, no. He said, it doesn't say that one has to go to the Levites. He said, that one is to use for those within your gates. And he said, you can help individuals directly. If you don't know who to help, which is usually the case, then you can send it to headquarters and they get requests from people who need help. But if you want to help somebody directly, there's nothing wrong with that. The reason most send third tithe in to the church is because, well, I want it done legally, but I also want a receipt because I want the tax deduction from it. Or they do it because they know that if it goes into the church is going to try to help those directly who are requesting need or have needs to be taken care of. During that third tithe year when I was a young adult, I actually helped my grandmother, who my grandfather had died. My grandmother moved into a small senior center, senior community. She had her own little apartment, but she was struggling with some things and the apartment needed some upkeep. And I was able to help her. Now, she was a subscriber and a coworker, but she was in need. She's a widow, and she was within my gates of being able to help. Also, a couple of widows or single parents that I personally knew needed the help in the congregation. That's within my ability to help them, and I did. The problem comes when we don't know. Well, I think so-and-so's in need, and I'm just going to come and give them a wad of cash at church. And they're like, I didn't really need that, but I'm not going to say no. People have given individuals money or finances when it wasn't necessarily needed. Or sometimes people say, yes, I need money. There have been individuals in the church who've done that over the years. It happens where they say, I need money, and I start asking church members. And there was one particular year that an individual didn't save their tithe, didn't pay the first tithe, didn't save the second tithe. Crocodile tears. I'm not going to be able to go to the feast, and ended up getting so much money that she skipped church and went to Disneyland with her kids because he had all this money to spend. I'm like, okay, you see those who are in need and you see those who are in want. But sometimes we don't know. And again, that's often why people say, well, I just want to give it to the church and let the church do that. We've had individuals who in the past, you rarely saw them at church, if at all. But they would show up around Pentecost. And it was only for a couple of weeks. And you say, well, why Pentecost? Because back in Worldwide Church of God, around Pentecost is when festival assistance applications came out. And you'd see them, and they'd show up, and they'd fill out an application, I need festival assistance, and you wouldn't see them all summer, and then you see them at the feast, because they got their assistance. Then you wouldn't see them after the feast all the way until Pentecost the next year. They wanted money for the feast, but they didn't want to attend services, they didn't want to be a part of the church. They were just collecting a church paycheck. And again, it's sad that those things happen, and not everybody that requests assistance is like that, we know that. But individuals have done that on rare occasion. There are plenty who have legitimate need and do receive help getting to the feast. We're able to help a large number of individuals around the world be able to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, internationally as well as in the U.S. And there are a number who receive festival assistance, even in their local areas. And you say, well, if they're tithing, why didn't they have enough? Sometimes it's a matter of they didn't have an income to tithe on or an increase. Sometimes it's because they've had a very difficult year and weren't able to work because of health or other reasons, or their income was not enough to go to the feast. It's not that they were saying, I need all of it paid for. Sometimes it was just enough assistance to help them to be able to make ends meet so they could attend the feast. But what about the rest of the year? There are those who need help on a regular basis or regular assistance. Or there's times where individuals will need assistance one time. Some need help on a monthly basis. And again, the church has individuals that we help on a regular basis. They're set up with monthly assistance because of the government that they live in or under, or whatever the situation may be, where they need help for a certain period of time. Some countries need help internationally. When we have disasters, like for instance, some of the things that have happened in the Philippines or other areas of the world where they have typhoons or flooding, whatever it may be, sometimes we send assistance to those countries. Sometimes it's because of a pandemic that hits and because of a hard time, and people during COVID, when it first started, people are like, I haven't been able to work and I don't have enough money to make ends meet, and I just need a little bit of help. Sometimes it's because of the governments individuals live under, and the governments suppress them or take much of their income. But if you are in a position or have need, we shouldn't hesitate to ask. Too many times it's those who are in need and who really have a need who say, well, I don't want to have to ask the church, and I don't want to bother the church. And those who have a want, and they're like, I'll get as much as I can. But the people who really need it should not be embarrassed or afraid to say, I need some assistance, I need some help. I think all of us have been at that point sometime in our life, unless you're related to J.D. Rockefeller in some way and he's helping you out. But we need that help from time to time. But let your pastor know if it's temporary or even if it's on a longer term basis, it's not something that should be neglected because third tithe is there for that. And the church has funds specifically set aside for that. But first, when individuals ask for church assistance or this third tithe, we help search government assistance programs because most of us in our taxes have paid into that. And there are so many government programs that people say, well, I didn't realize that was there. When I was in California, there were assistance programs to help with electric bills, assistance programs to help with gas bills or water bills, because none of our bills were combined, similar to some places where you have your utility bill. There are multiple different companies, but they had systems and there was programs set up where they would help pay for utilities. There's also rent assistance, which came from a different organization, different group. But we look through these government assistance programs, and sometimes it's for food, sometimes it's to help with housing, sometimes it's to help with schooling, whatever the case may be. But we have paid into that as individuals, and that's the first place that the church goes, because you'd be surprised how many programs are simply untapped because we don't see the government advertising saying, if you need money, call us and we'll help pay your utility bills. They would have their phones ringing all the time with people asking. So they don't advertise it, they don't say anything about it. But as a church, we know that those programs are there, and we search for that, and we say, there's assistance, there's help we can get from those funds that the church members have already paid into. The church and we as members want to help those in need, and we should. Deuteronomy chapter 26 and verse 12. Deuteronomy 26 and verse 12. He says, when you have finished laying aside all of the tithe of your increase, King James Version says, all the tithing of all the tithes, plural, of your increase. In the third year, the year of tithing. Now, there's no doubt why it's called the year of tithing. If you're paying first tithe, second tithe, third tithe, he said that's the year of tithing. That It seems like so much goes towards tithe. But he calls it the year of tithing, not because you skip the festival tithe and pay it to the third. Some have convinced themselves of that, even within the church, that, well, every third year I just give my festival tithe to the needy. Well, then how are you going to follow that command to be there? How would you get to the feast? You'd have to skip every third year. Well, God designed it that way. I'll just skip every third feast. You'd be missing out on what God has prepared and missing out on that invitation because he invites you every year. Notice, he said, and have given it to the Levite, the stranger, given it to. You don't give it to the Levites as the church. You give it to the Levite, stranger, fatherless, widow, so that they may eat it within your gates or your realm of influence and be filled. Then you shall say before the Lord your God. Now, here's that word before. You shall say before. You shall say it to his face or face to face in a relationship. It's that same phrase, being in his presence. I have removed the holy tithe from my house, and also have given him to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow. He's talking about the third tithe. He said, I've set aside that tithe, and it is being used for the fatherless widow, according to all your commandments, which you have commanded me. And he says, I have not transgressed your commandment. Transgress means to sin. He said, I haven't sinned, nor have I forgotten them. I have paid this tithe. So is tithing and the third tithe the commandment? It says here that it is. Now God says in this passage, it is holy. He said, I have removed the holy tithe, and it is commanded. Every third and sixth year, there were third tithe years. The seventh year was the year of rest or year of release. And in the seventh year, usually in that land cycle, they would let the ground rest. And if you're letting your fields rest and you're not planting, you're not harvesting, you're not increasing. So you wouldn't have that particular tithe that year. Now, how does third tithe apply in our modern age? I mentioned earlier the headquarters said we pay it differently than we did 30 years ago. Just as there are descriptions of the first and second tithe and where they go, how they're calculated, there is for the third tithe as well. The third tithe is calculated in the church differently than we did in the past, but it's still commanded, and we still say there is a third tithe. Here's what the church has taught for many years. In today's society, some national governments have established mandatory taxes for social welfare and for the care of those who are in need. This is what the third tithe is biblically used for. It is for those in need. It's for the widows, those who are widowed or orphaned or in need of help. Should we pay Social Security or welfare tax to the government annually to be used for the needy, the widow, etc.? How would we pay every year and then still every third year in addition to that? And then also every 3 years pay that third tithe for the same purpose. The purpose of this is to care for those who are in need and those who are within our control to be able to help. And it is about developing that relationship with God and our neighbor. So can you still send in your third tithe? People still ask that today. Well, I want to still tithe every third year and then seventh, have a year of rest and then start over again. Can you still send in third tithe? Yes, and people do. What we don't want to do is say, well, I feel it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. If the church says this, I'm going to do it even though I disagree and I feel like I'm sinning. Well, you don't want to sin against your conscience. The church does not control your tithing. Now, in the past, there were pastors who did. There were individuals who tried to control tithing and where it went or how much or what was considered your increase. But you control your tithing because it is a relationship between you and God. Now, we have taught, in quotes, in places where governments provide specific programs where the intent is to care for the poor, the needy, and the elderly, as the biblical third tithe was designed to do, and where these programs are supported by the annual rate that is greater than the third tithe, that members are not expected to pay what amounts to be an additional third tithe to the church. It says if you're paying annually and it's more than a third tithe every 3 years. So if the government were to take out less taxes, which is very unlikely, less taxes for the poor and needy, and it didn't meet a tenth over 3 years, then we would need to pay the remainder of that tithe. For the U.S., it meets far more than a tithe. If you figure out 10% every third year, that about, if you had the same income every year, that's about 3.3% a year. And the government takes out 15 to 20% every year. So over the course of time, you have far more being spent on third tithe or going into third tithe than is used. Which is why we say, okay, there's so much third tithe that the church members have paid. Let's get those government programs and use that because that's what it was sent in for. The church is therefore diligent to utilize government resources in getting assistance to our members, and that's where we pay our third tithe into. But there's always going to be those who are in need, especially in this age. And even today in the church, there are individuals who are going to need to be cared for beyond what the governments allow. Because there are times we've gone to the government programs and they said, no, this person doesn't qualify. Okay, well, what about this? No, they don't qualify. What about utilities? Nope, they don't qualify. What about food stamps? Nope, they don't qualify. And the government says, no, we're going to turn down everything that you're asking. There are times that people... We don't say, well, I guess you really didn't have a need because the government said no. No, we realize those needs are there and they have to be cared for. And the church has expressed that those who are able can contribute to what we call the assistance fund or that third tithe fund to be able to care for those in need. Some are able, some are not. In giving of our offerings to God, God says, 3 seasons you come before me and you give as you are able. He doesn't say, come and give more money than you have and struggle for the next month and not be able to pay your expenses or your bills. He says, as you are able, Deuteronomy 16:16. But some of us may be saying, well, having extra to send in for assistance fund is not possible for me. Well, again, if we're not able, we're not able. Sometimes that's like the term in the past, and I didn't understand this as a child, excess second tithe, and I was like, what do you mean excess? You have more tithe than you can spend. And I asked my mom, I said, are there really people who have more money than they can spend at the feast? We started off in Tucson, Arizona. Me and my 2 older brothers and my younger sister and my mom in a camper in a KOA campground at the feast site. And after about 3 years, we went into a hotel. And when I say a hotel, it was on, if you've never been to Tucson, there's a huge strip called the Miracle Mile. And it's a mile long and there's hotels on both sides, but the hotels were very inexpensive hotels. But we thought we're rich. We're in a hotel for 8 days. We are rich. I would hate to see that hotel today, what it looks like. But we thought moving out of a camper with 5 of us into a hotel room, this is amazing. But there are individuals who have excess, either in their income and can contribute a little bit, or in their tithes to be able to contribute that what we call tithe of the tithe for the feast. For years, again, we thought it was impossible to have excess or to have people that have more money than they can spend. And it took decades before I ever realized that. And finally, because of the blessings that God continued to pour out on me, I finally had an opportunity to do that and to give back and to pay for things and to help people at the Feast of Tabernacles. If we do have funds available and we help others, or available to help others, do we say, well, yeah, but God says spend it on yourself, whatever your heart desires. And my heart desires to spend it on me. Do we help ourselves or do we help others? And are we cheerful givers? God wants to know, where is your heart in this? If I have blessed you tremendously and you have far more than you can spend, are you going to say, well, now I can get that new car I wanted, or now I can buy a boat? And people have done that at the feast. They're like, my heart desires a boat, and I've got the money, I'm going to buy a new boat. And it's not that anything's wrong with that. God has blessed them with the money, and they were able to buy that. But are we able to help others? And do we honestly believe that if we tithe or we give money to the needy, do we understand and believe that God says, test me and prove me, that I will not bless you even more? Most people in the world think, well, if I tithe at all, I'm not going to be able to make ends meet financially. My third tithe year, I can tell you, I was paying 30% in tithes and 20 or 25% in taxes, and I was more financially blessed than I'd ever been in any previous year. God can bless in that way. Many think, well, if I'm tithing, I don't have enough because there's not enough of my money to pay tithe. Well, again, as we covered in the first sermon, it's not your money. It all belongs to God. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9. He says, honor the Lord with your possessions, and with the first fruits of all your increase, so your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. He said, you're going to have more than you can use if you honor me with your possessions. If we have a relationship where you are following my way of life and you're helping other people and you're following my commands. And then I want to finish in Malachi chapter 3. Malachi chapter 3, verse 10. Scripture we're familiar with because Malachi talks about the tithing system. And in Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, I'm going to read from the New King James Version. He says, bring all the tithes into the storehouse. All the tithes. Now, he doesn't say bring first or second or third. He says bring all the tithes. Now, he already said earlier in the chapter that if you don't pay a tithe, you're robbing him. So it could be collectively, but he says bring all the tithes into the storehouse that there may be food in my house. There may be food in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. And he says, and try me now this day, says the Lord. So he said, I want you to test me, whether it be first tithe, second tithe, third tithe. He said, I want you to test me. If I will not open up for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you such blessing that there will not be room enough to receive it.